All my intimate friends abhor me, and those whom I have loved have turned against me. My bones stick to my skin and to my flesh, and I have escaped by the skin of my teeth. Have mercy on me, O you my friends, for the hand of God has touched me. Why do you, like God, pursue me? Why are you not satisfied with my flesh? Oh, that my words were written. Oh, that they were inscribed in a book. Oh, that with an iron pen and lead they were engraved in the rock forever. For I know that my Redeemer lives, and at last he will stand upon the earth. And after my skin has thus been destroyed, yet in my flesh I shall see God, whom I shall see for myself, and my eyes shall behold, and not another. My heart faints within me. This is the word of God to us.
Okay, Job. Here we go. You ready? Okay, we're still in the book of Job, if you've forgotten. So here we go, week 3. Have you ever noticed how after a major tragedy or some crazy catastrophe, there's these armchair theologians or these armchair philosophers that just come out of the woodworks that want to explain, here is why this terrible tragic event has happened. Have you ever noticed that? You look back and you think about these terrible things in our past. There's always someone coming out and saying, well, let me theologize this tragedy, or let me explain philosophically why this bad thing has happened. Shortly after 9/11, the late Jerry Falwell Sr., he suggested that these attacks happened because God was actually angry at America. And here's what he said. Some of you might have heard this in a radio interview that he gave. He said, I really believe that the pagans and the abortionists and the feminists and the gays and the lesbians who are actively trying to make that an alternative lifestyle, the ACLU, People for the American Way, all of them who have tried to secularize America, I point the finger in their face and say, you helped this happen. It's an explanation that he gave for why 9/11 happened. Around that same time, there's actually another famous evangelist that's on TV named James Robison, and he listed out a very different set of American failures and sins to why we had these attacks happen to our country. He pointed to the arrogance in our relationships with third world countries. He pointed to the fact that we plunder these other nations' resources while also supporting their oppressive leadership. He talked about our indifference to the world's poverty and the pain that we've caused to other nations. And then he said these words. He said, anytime you get away from God, you do become vulnerable. Bad judgment always leaves the door open to perpetrators of pain. In other words, there's a connection between our behavior and the tragic things that have happened on 9/11. And these are the connections that many people make. Some of us even remember this happening in Moore, Oklahoma, when the last round of tornadoes came through in 2013. You may remember that we had Westboro Baptist Church show up. Do you remember this? And they were holding up signs that said, God hates Moore. And it's like, well, see, of course God hates Moore because this giant tornado swept through, and so that must be a sign of his hatred for an entire city. Around that same time, you might recall Pat Robertson from the 700 Club suggesting that, quote, if the people of Moore would have prayed harder, God would have intervened. And I remember hearing that, and I was like, I just lost my house in that tornado, and prayer was something we were doing. And he was saying, well, if you would have just prayed harder, then here's what would have stopped happening. The tornadoes would have ceased. God would have intervened. And here's the thing, like, I'm kind of picking on the religious circle for just a minute, but it's not just people in the religious circle that have an armchair observation for why suffering happens. There are even people who are on the opposite end of the religious spectrum that want to say, well, here's why bad things happen to good people. An atheist by the name of Richard Carrier says, the naturalist response to this question is fairly obvious. Bad things happen to good people because the universe is an unintelligent, undesigned monstrosity that has no concern for whether it helps or hurts, and it doesn't even know or care who is good or bad. Happy Sunday morning. The universe doesn't believe in you, right? It's an ahumanist. Doesn't believe that you exist. So here's the thing, when tragedy strikes, everybody has this clamoring to answer the question why. Like, we all want to know this painful event or this catastrophe. And here's what's fascinating about this. Rarely, if ever, is the answer, I don't know. Usually it's, well, here's why. It's because of this behavior, or this thing that you did in your past, or because you function this way, this is why this bad thing has happened. We even do this on a personal level. When something happens, isn't it really terrible when you go through a painful event and someone in your life is trying to bring you comfort, but what they end up doing is making some sort of hot take observation for why you're going through the pain that you're going through? Well, it's because of this behavior or this thing or that thing that you did. And if you don't have a friend in your life that has done that to you, then maybe you're like me and it's your own soul that does it. Well, here's why this thing is happening to me. It's because of this thing in my past. Or had I not done this or whatever, this is why I'm experiencing the current crazy circumstances that I'm experiencing. And this is what happens in Job's life when we get to chapter 4. What happens in chapter 4 is that Job's friends show up and they move out of the place of silence, out of the place of offering him the ministry of presence, into the place of offering him the world's wisdom and their hot takes on why Job is experiencing what he's experiencing. So that's what we're looking at today in chapter 4 through 37. If you're not familiar with how the book is laid out, or maybe this is your first time with us, let me kind of show you where we've been. So we started out this series on the book of Job looking at how this is an ancient wisdom literature book meant to help us grapple with the world that you and I find ourselves in and how we should think of God in this world. And there are two major questions that are being posed in the book of Job. If you want to know what the whole book is about, you can really summarize it with these two questions. You have the accuser, and his primary question is this: is it right and good for God to reward and bless the righteous and punish the wicked? Like, is that a good policy with which to structure the world? Or does that set up some sort of accidental prosperity gospel where people are going to only obey God because they're afraid of getting crushed by God? Or they're going to only obey God because they want to receive blessing from God? So this is the accuser's question he's posing in the book: is it right and good as a policy for God to bless the righteous and punish the wicked? Job's question is very different, though. Job's question is it right and good for God to allow the righteous to suffer? In other words, is it right and okay for bad things to happen to good people? So we looked at that as we kind of unpacked the book, and Job is this blameless man. He's a wealthy man. He's the greatest man in the East, we learn in chapter 1. And yet God allows this tragic series of painful events to enter into his world, not because of his sin, but actually to answer those two questions. And as this tragedy unfolds in Job's life, his friends show up, and what his friends begin to do is beautiful. They sit with him for 7 days and 7 nights, and they don't say a word. They weep with their friend. They grieve with their friend. And then in chapter 3, Job finally breaks the silence, and he begins to lament and curse the day that he was born. No more birthdays for Job. I hate that day. Let it perish. And then from chapter 3, what he begins to do is he starts to again and again cross the line, and he laments, and he's emotionally volatile, and at times he's accusing God. He's lashing out at God in anger. And finally in chapter 4, Job's friends can't take it anymore. They feel like he's crossed the line, and they're now going to respond to what Job is saying. So here's the rest of the book until we get to the very end. The rest of the book is Job's 3 friends are going to respond to Job individually. They're going to give a speech. Job, here's why you're experiencing what you're experiencing. And then Job's going to respond back to that and say, I don't agree with you, and here's why. And then the next friend, Job, here's why you're experiencing the pain. And then Job responds back. And then the next friend. And this cycle repeats itself almost 3 complete times throughout the whole book, where his friends say something, Job responds. Friends say something, Job responds. So instead of reading chapters 4 through 37 today and kind of unpacking all of that in great detail, because that would be really depressing for everybody in the room, what we're actually going to do is summarize each of these speeches that Job's 3 friends give, because each friend represents a different set of wisdom that the world has to offer for why we're going through what we're going through. Sound good? Okay, that's what we're doing. If that's not okay, then sorry, that's the plan. So I don't have another plan. So here we go, Job's 3 friends. The first friend we meet is Eliphaz. Eliphaz wants to say that Job's suffering is a result of God's loving discipline. We meet Eliphaz in chapter 4, and he's actually the most kind and compassionate out of the 3 friends, and he says a lot of really true things, but the problem is they're not going to land with Job properly because they're not matching up with Job's actual experience. So here we go, Job chapter 4, verse 7. Remember, who that was innocent ever perished? Or where were the upright cut off? As I have seen, those who plow iniquity and sow troubles reap the same. By the breath of God they perish, by the blast of his anger they are consumed. Fast forward to chapter 5, verse 17. Behold, blessed is the one whom God reproves. Therefore despise not the discipline of the Almighty, for he wounds, but he binds up. He shatters, but his hands heal. So here's Eliphaz's hot take. He basically sees the world as a moral universe that's governed by God, where God is both good and he's just. And he responds to the righteous by blessing them, and he responds to the wicked by punishing them. And when someone who chooses to fear God and turn away from evil and actually live in light of who God is and try to order their steps carefully and do the right thing as opposed to the wrong thing, what Eliphaz believes is that that's naturally going to work out way better for the person than if they throw off the fear of God and decide to be their own kind of commander of their own self and do their own right and wrong definitions and pursue the way that they want to go. And he's kind of taking a lot of this off of the book of Proverbs, which is generally true statements about how to live in the world, right? He's saying, hey, listen, if you actually fear God and do the right thing, your life's going to work out great. But if you err off of that path, if you run from God, if you throw off his ways and choose to live however you want, it's going to end really poorly for you. And so, Job, what's happening to you is that God is actually, out of his love, he's pouring out suffering on you to discipline you. You see, you're doing something wrong. You're doing something sinful. There's something off in your life. And so God is allowing these painful events to come into your life to discipline you and to teach you and train you so that you might learn to fear God, so that you might learn how to walk with God. Obviously, like, you're reaping what you're sowing on some level, and this isn't God's hatred for you. It's actually because he loves you and he's trying to help you. That's why you're suffering. Now, it is true that God does this for us at times, isn't it? Where we do stuff that is wrong and we actually receive not punishment for that, but we receive discipline for that. There is truth here that God is, punishing the wicked and he's pouring out his grace on the righteous. That is true. There's some truth to that. The problem is, as Eliphaz is staring at Job, he's saying, God's disciplining you for your sin. And Job is saying, what sin? Like, I believe that, but show me what I've done wrong. And what we remember from Job chapter 1 and chapter 2 is that Job is blameless. He hasn't done anything wrong to deserve what he's experiencing. This is Eliphaz's hot take, and he misses the mark. Second friend is Bildad. Bildad sees Job as primarily experiencing a suffering, and that's a natural consequence for his sin. We first meet Bildad in chapter 8, and Bildad is the most black and white of these 3 friends. He doesn't mince his words. He's not nearly as nice as Eliphaz. He's just very, very black and white, kind of cold-blooded in a way. And he follows a similar vein of thought as Eliphaz with a few differences. Look at chapter 8, verse 2. Does God pervert justice, or does the Almighty pervert the right? And then listen to this. If your children have sinned against him, he has delivered them into the hand of their transgression. Remember, Job's kids all died. A tornado hit the house, and his 7 sons and 3 daughters, they died, right? He's saying they sinned, and then they got the punishment for their sin. Simple as that. He goes on, he says, if you will seek God and plead with the Almighty for mercy, if you are pure and upright, surely then he will rouse himself for you and restore your rightful habitation. And though your beginning was small, your latter days will be very great. So here's Bildad's take. Hey, Job, there's a direct connection here, buddy, between the suffering that you're experiencing and the sin in your life. Your kids sinned, God wiped them out. You're experiencing present suffering, it's because there's some sin in your life. And if all you'll do, if you'll just turn back to God, if you'll just repent of your sin, then you're moving out of God's kind of category of dislike, where he's pouring out punishment on you, into his category of now he likes you and he's going to pour out his blessing on you. This is what you have to do, right? Now, here's the problem with Bildad's hot take. It's similar to what we might describe as karma. Like, if you do good things, good's going to come into your life. If you do bad things, then, well, you're going to just expect bad things to happen. You reap what you sow. Here's the problem. It is true on some level that you reap what you sow, but sometimes you reap stuff that you never, ever, ever sowed. And that's a category of suffering that you and I often don't have and need to wrestle with. What Job is reaping has nothing to do with anything that he's done. And by the way, this thinking that Bildad portrays here slips into our narrative, especially as evangelical Christians, whatever the heck that even means anymore, I don't know. But this slips into our thinking where we start to view people through that lens. You look at someone who's experiencing blessing and you go, they must be doing something right. You look at someone who's experiencing hardship or pain or poverty and you go, they must be doing something wrong. David Atkinson says this, fellow travelers down this road include all those whose politics tempt them to equate material prosperity with the good life, and who see the poor and disadvantaged as themselves entirely to blame for their plight. It is all part of the Bildad logic, which suggests that, quote, pull yourself together is the only response to suffering and deprivation. Oh, you're poor? Well, you're obviously not very educated. Oh, you're poor? Well, you obviously haven't really tried hard enough. Or if only you would take a hold of your life and work hard like I've done. If only you'll, right? Fill in the blank. And basically what's happened is we've slipped into Bildad thinking as we navigate our way through life. If you're doing well, it's because God is blessing you as a direct result of your lifestyle. And if you're doing poorly, he's actually pouring out his justice on you as a direct result of your lifestyle. Both miss the mark. Bildad, suffering is not natural consequences. The third friend is a guy by the name of Zophar, and he primarily sees suffering as punishment. We first meet Zophar in chapter 11, and Zophar is brutal. He is the worst friend. Like, you don't ever want a friend like Zophar in your life. If you have a Zophar in your life, I'm so sorry. Get better friends, please. Because this guy is a complete jerk. He believes that Job deserves every bit of his suffering and a little bit more. So here's what he says in chapter 11, verse 2. Should a multitude of words go unanswered and a man full of talk be judged right? Talking to Job. Should your babble silence men, and when you mock, shall no one shame you? Isn't that great? Like, I'm about to shame you, so just buckle up and get ready. That's what he's saying. Verse 4, for you say, my doctrine is pure, and I am clean in God's eyes. But oh, that God would speak and open his lips to you. Know then that God exacts of you less than your guilt deserves. What? Job has suffered more than anybody I personally know. He's lost his kids, he's lost his possessions, he's lost every earthly thing that he's ever owned. All of it is gone. His own health is struggling. And this last guy, Zophar, is saying, it really should be way worse. Like, what is even way worse? Like, what is way worse? Like, he already has a wife that's telling him to curse God and die, and he's got 3 friends that are just filling his head with, what could possibly be worse? And yet Zophar is saying, God is actually being kind to you and only bringing this level of destruction into your life. He goes on to say this in chapter 20, verse 4. Do you not know this from of old, since man was placed on the earth, that the exalting of the wicked is short, and the joy of the godless but for a moment? Though his height mount up to the heavens and his head reach to the clouds, he will perish forever like his own dung. Wow, thanks, Zophar. And those who have seen him will say, where is he? The heavens will reveal his iniquity, and the earth will rise up against him. The possessions of his house will be carried away, dragged off in the day of God's wrath. This is the wicked man's portion from God, the heritage decreed for him by God. Here's Zophar's hot take. Bad things happen to bad people, period. And it could be worse because you're way worse than what God is actually pouring out. Bad things happen to bad people. Now, is it true that God brings justice to the wicked? Yes, it is true. And that's not a popular thing that we talk about in our cultural context, but it is actually true. There is coming a day of reckoning where God is going to bring justice, and he's going to actually judge both the living and the dead by Jesus Christ. This is going to happen. So there is some element of truth to the reality that God brings justice to the wicked. The problem is that Zophar doesn't have all the answers here in this equation. He's looking at Job and he's saying, you've experienced all this tragedy. It's because God is punishing you, just full stop. And it should be worse because you are worse. This is what Job is experiencing with his friend Zophar. He's missing the mark here ultimately because haven't we known people who are really, really godless that are doing just fine? Haven't we known people that are really, really godly that suffer a lot? See, Zophar, his logic and his explanation doesn't line up. The fourth friend, and by the way, some of you are like, I didn't know there was a fourth friend. You don't know that there's a fourth friend until you get to chapter 32, and then there's this random guy named Elihu, and Elihu just kind of shows up, right? He's Job's fourth random friend, and what's bizarre about Elihu is all these different commentators, there's different ways of understanding, but a lot of scholars think that he was just placed in the story by the author for comedic relief, because you're reading these chapters, and it's rough for chapter after chapter after chapter. And then it's like the author's like, now let me just introduce this crazy young fiery guy named Elihu. And that's similar to what happens. He's kind of apparently just been sitting there silently, listening to the speeches unfold, listening to the explanations. And Elihu is this young fiery man who looks at the three friends and he's like, you guys are completely way off base. You're totally wrong. He looks at Job and he's like, you're completely way off base. You're totally wrong. I actually understand this thing really well, so let me go ahead and talk, right? He's like every young person you've ever met. Here's what he says in verse 2 of chapter 32. Then Elihu, the son of Barachel, the Buzite of the family of Ram, burned with anger. He burned with anger at Job because he justified himself rather than God. He burned with anger also at Job's three friends because they had found no answer, although they had declared Job to be in the wrong. And Elihu said, I love this, I am young in years, and you are aged. Therefore I was timid and afraid to declare my opinion to you. I said, let days speak, and many years teach wisdom. But it is the spirit in man, the breath of the Almighty that makes him understand. It is not the old who are wise, nor the aged who understand what is right. Therefore I say, listen to me. Let me also declare my opinion. And that's exactly what he does. He declares his opinion for 5 chapters, and his opinion is dumb. His opinion is as bad as the three friends. It's almost identical to what the other three friends have said, but just with more words. Because isn't that what us young people do sometimes? No, you have it wrong. Let me say the wrong thing even longer. You're off. Let me say what's off in an even worse way. And Elihu basically says the same thing with a little bit of a twist. Here's his twist. Job, you're not suffering for sins that you've committed in your past. Here's why you're suffering. Because God looked down the corridor of time, and God noticed that when the suffering would enter your world, you would respond like a crazy man. And it's because of your terrible response and the way that you've lashed out in anger at God in the midst of your suffering, as God looked down the corridor of time. He knew you would do that, so he allowed the suffering to come for the sin of doing that. It's kind of like Minority Report. If you've ever seen the movie Minority Report, it's like, we're arresting you, but I haven't done anything wrong. No, but we know in the future that you're going to commit a crime. So we're arresting you ahead of time. That's what he says. He says, Job, you're suffering not for sins that you've done in your past, but God knew you would respond so terribly to suffering, so he allowed you to suffer. What a great argument. This is the best wisdom that the world has to offer for why bad things happen to good people. Let that sink in. And here's what's crazy. We have chapter after chapter after chapter of these wise, sage-like friends doing their very best with their friend to move from comfort into confronting him and saying, Job, ultimately the problem lies with you, and here's why, and let me explain. And every bit of the wisdom of the world behind suffering falls short in Job's case. And here's the whole point, friends. Here's the whole point of chapter 4 through 37. Is the world and its wisdom cannot explain such a crazy, nuanced, complicated thing like suffering that exists, especially when it relates to good people, the righteous, people that are actually wanting to give their whole heart to Jesus. Why do bad things happen? Why do we experience such terrible tragedies? Why are there things that are unexplainable? Everybody in the world wants to give a hot take, and Job is not satisfied. Here's our own wisdom and our cultural moment of why bad things exist. Just a couple of the most popular answers. Karma. If I'm experiencing good in my life, blessing, success, happiness, whatever it may be, it must be because I'm doing right. Have you ever thought that? Man, things are going well. I must be doing something right. I have more money in my bank account now than I've ever had. I must be doing something right. My relationship is really thriving with my spouse or with my roommates. I must be doing something right. Life feels easy and good. Everything is working out. It must be because I've been trying really hard and everything is going according to plan. And then conversely, whenever something tragic happens, depression sets in, you experience a failure, you lose a job, a relationship falls apart, whatever it might be, you go, I must be doing something totally wrong. Karma is a common answer for why we experience suffering in our world. Another answer is nihilism. Nihilism is basically what that atheist said at the very beginning. The universe is an unintelligent, undesigned monstrosity that has no concern for whether it helps or hurts, and it doesn't even know or care who is good or bad. In other words, suffering is meaningless. So just learn to deal with it. Just be okay with it. Like it's just a fact of life. We live in a world that doesn't even care. Nihilism. The third wisdom that friends can offer in our suffering is K-love platitudes. I realize I've been making fun of K-love a lot. If you were here last week and this week, you're like, he really hates K-love. And you wouldn't be wrong, right? But I'm not intentionally trying to do that. My point is just to say that the positive and encouraging message is often what we try to give people in their suffering. It's, hey, listen, God's going to work all things together for good. Now that's actually true and right. That's from Romans 8:28. But sometimes I think that we throw that out there in a way that's really unhelpful and minimizes the tragedy that's actually happening in the moment. Because let's not forget, Jesus himself, he wept with those who wept. He didn't show up at Lazarus' tomb and go, it's all going to work out, guys, even though he knew it was about to. We read, Jesus wept, right? So Caleb platitudes. Hey man, cheer up. Good's going to come out of this. Is it though? Maybe not my definition of good. The last common wisdom in our cultural moment is cold sovereignty. Cold sovereignty. And what I mean by that is sometimes there are people within the Reformed tradition, which by the way, theological nerds out there, I'm also in the Reformed tradition, right? Full-blown five-pointer. But here's the thing. Sometimes the way that people talk about sovereignty, especially as it relates to suffering, sometimes even well-known pastors, they say things at moments that are incredibly unhelpful, and I actually think borderline make God the author of sin. So we go, God's in control. I mean, he actually orchestrated that event. Did he? Let's be a little bit more cautious with our words. Cold sovereignty. Here's the message of Job. Friends, yes, it's true we live in a morally ordered universe. That's true. But we also have a real spiritual enemy. The accuser does exist. And the accuser is trying to wreak havoc. And we need to remember that that's an actual reality. Bad things really do happen to good people. See Jesus Christ. Bad things happen to good people. See Jesus Christ. And yet, God really is in control. You don't read the book of Job and think that God's lost control at any point. He actually has the accuser on a leash. But God doesn't run the world the way that Job's friends assume, which is with this strict retribution principle. You do good, I'll bless you. You do bad, I'll punish you. He doesn't run the world that way. In fact, what we learn at the very end is that God runs the world with his wisdom. And you and I should learn to actually fear God and trust his wisdom in the middle of suffering, not trying to explain it, not trying to even understand it, but getting to the place of saying, I'm relinquishing my life into your hands, and I trust you, and I fear you. This is the wisdom that the book of Job is trying to offer. Not another hot take for why bad things are happening, but just to get us to the place where we can go, I trust you, God. I don't get it. I don't like it, but I trust you, God. That's what the book is trying to do. Job's friends, they completely miss this, and they offer Job hot takes, and Job is not impressed. Their words are empty and they're worthless, and listen to where they leave Job. This is just a smattering of Job's responses to his friends. My brothers are treacherous as a torrent bed, as torrential streams that pass away. Chapter 12, verse 2, no doubt you are the people, and wisdom will die with you. He's saying that mockingly. You are the intelligent ones. Wisdom's going to die when you die. Says this in chapter 12, verse 4, I'm a laughing stock to my friends. I, who called to God, and he answered me, a just and blameless man, am a laughing stock. He says this in chapter 13, as for you, you whitewashed with lies, worthless physicians are you all. Oh, that you would keep silent, and it would be your wisdom. He goes on to say this in chapter 16, I've heard many such things, miserable comforters are you all. Chapter 19, how long will you torment me and break me in pieces with words? Chapter 19, verse 21, have mercy on me, O you, my friends, for the hand of God has touched me. Have mercy on me. Job gets to the place at the end of the book and he's like, I don't even have friends anymore. My friends don't even help me. Like there's no wisdom, there's nothing. And here's what the author's trying to do. He's trying to drive you to the place in your relationship with Jesus where you go, I have nowhere else to turn. I need help. I need someone to come through for me. And then he begins to say these words in chapter 19. We read it at the very beginning. For I know that my Redeemer lives, and at last he will stand upon the earth. And after my skin has been thus destroyed, yet in my flesh I shall see God. He says, I know that my Redeemer lives. And here's what's ironic. He's saying, there's got to be someone out there somewhere that's going to help me. There's got to be someone out there somewhere that can come and explain to me what's going on. There's got to be someone out there somewhere who can come and plead my case. And actually what he's looking for is someone to help him go to court against God. God has crushed me. God is against me. There's got to be somebody out there that can help me argue my case before God because I really am in the right here. And Job could have never, ever, ever anticipated the ending of this story and what you and I now know because of Jesus Christ. What he wanted was someone to argue his case before God because he thought God was against him. Do you know what he ultimately gets and what we get? God himself coming for us, not to argue back, but to argue our case, even though we were the ones who sinned against him. We actually get a Redeemer who comes to fully understand us. And so think about this, the difference between Job's friends and Jesus Christ. Job's friends are easily annoyed with Job. They come to comfort him, and they very quickly move into confronting and accusing him. They come to sit in the ash heap with him, and then they can't handle it anymore. They think he's crossed the line. They lash out in anger at Job. Now think about Jesus. Jesus doesn't come initially to comfort us, only to be quickly annoyed and eventually accuse us. Jesus doesn't come to offer us a hot take and explain away our suffering. Jesus comes and he sits in the ash heap with us. And then what he does is he goes a step further. He climbs up on a cross on our behalf. And instead of taking our sin and our suffering and throwing it back in our face, Jesus takes our sin and our suffering and he puts it on himself. And it's in our place for our sin that he dies. Jesus doesn't blame us. Jesus comes to take the blame for us. Jesus doesn't come to accuse us. He takes to be the sponge that absorbs all the accusations of the enemy on our behalf. Jesus comes as the friend that, as you're reading the story, he's the friend that you want. And he comes not just to die for our sin, but ultimately to rise again so that he can recreate a world where suffering will no longer have a place. What kind of friend is Jesus to us? This is what the story is teaching us, is that, man, we need a redeemer to show up. And instead of having someone shows up to argue our case before God, God himself comes to argue our case when we didn't deserve it. What an amazing ending to the story. So let me end with this. I don't know where you're at, and I don't know what you're going through. I don't know if you're heading out of a dark season, or if things are going great, or if you find yourself in the middle of a dark place. But if you find yourself in the middle of a dark place today, and you're asking why, and you're seeking out wisdom from the world to have you get an answer to the suffering and an answer to the tragedies and an answer to the catastrophe, I want to read this quote to you to remind you of what you have in Jesus. John Stott says this: "I could never myself believe in God if it were not for the cross. In the real world of pain, how could one worship a God who is immune to it? I've entered many Buddhist temples in different Asian countries, and I've stood respectfully before the statue of the Buddha, his legs crossed, arms folded, eyes closed, the ghost of a smile playing around his mouth, a remote look on his face, detached from the agonies of the world. But each time, after a while, I've had to turn away, and in imagination, I've turned instead to that lonely, twisted, tortured figure on the cross. Nails through hands and feet, back lacerated, limbs wrenched, brow bleeding from thorn pricks, mouth dry and intolerably thirsty, plunged into God-forsaken darkness. That is the God for me. He laid aside his immunity to pain. He entered our world of flesh and blood, tears and death. He suffered for us. Our sufferings become more manageable in the light of his. There's still a question mark against human suffering, but over it, we boldly stamp another mark, the cross that symbolizes divine suffering." Father, I pray for my friends. I pray that today, instead of having our questions answered, I pray that the stamp of the cross would be the thing that carries us on our dark day. That we serve a God who doesn't come to explain away, who doesn't come to offer us another hot take. We serve a God who in Christ suffered for us. Thank you, Jesus. For my friends that are suffering today, pray that you would meet them as one who understands. Comfort them as one who not only can relate, but experienced worse on our behalf and is ultimately going to fix the brokenness of this world. So we don't look to wisdom in this world. We don't look to hot takes or explanations. Teach us to look to you. In Jesus' name, amen.